Before dawn on July 5, 1943, the fields around Kursk were not quiet in the way a sleeping countryside is quiet. They were waiting. Soviet engineers had spent weeks burying mines, laying wire, digging trenches, sighting artillery, and marking anti-tank killing zones across a huge bulge in the eastern front. German troops facing them had been told that Operation Citadel would restore momentum after Stalingrad. Adolf Hitler needed a victory. The Red Army expected the blow. The place mattered because Kursk was a salient, a great outward curve in the Soviet line. German planners looked at that curve and saw a chance to pinch it off from north and south. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein argued for a powerful southern thrust, while General Walter Model's Ninth Army would attack from the north. If the two arms met, they could trap Soviet forces in the pocket and prove that Germany could still dictate the rhythm of war in the east. Yet the waiting changed the battle before it began. Hitler delayed the offensive while new Panther tanks, Tiger tanks, and Ferdinand tank destroyers reached the front. The machines looked formidable on paper, but delay gave Joseph Stalin's commanders more time. Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky advised absorbing the German attack inside prepared defenses, then launching counteroffensives when the attackers were spent. Konstantin Rokossovsky in the north and Nikolai Vadutin in the south built depth rather than a single thin line. That depth is the key to Kursk. The Soviet defense was not one trench waiting for a charge. It was belts of mines, anti-tank guns, infantry positions, artillery registration points, reserve armor, and communication lines behind the first positions. Some estimates for the whole battle vary because historians count different phases and sectors, but the scale was enormous. Millions of men across the wider campaign, thousands of tanks and guns and aircraft committed on both sides. The exact numbers are debated, the pattern is not. Germany was attacking into a prepared trap. In the early hours of July 5th, Soviet artillery struck German assembly areas before the main assault. That preemptive fire did not stop Citadel, but it announced that surprise had been lost. German artillery and aircraft answered. Mine-clearing teams moved under fire. Tanks crawled into lanes that engineers tried to open through the fields. Infantry followed through dust, smoke, and summer heat. Every yard was expensive because the battlefield had been measured in advance by defenders who expected armor to come exactly there. On the northern shoulder, Model's attack ran into Rokossovsky's layered defenses near Ponary and Olkhovka. The fighting became a brutal contest for ridges, villages, rail lines, and gun positions. Soviet anti-tank crews waited for side shots. Artillery batteries shifted fire by telephone and runner when wires survived, and by prearranged plans when they did not. German units still advanced in places, but they paid for distance with time, fuel, crews, and tanks that could not easily be replaced. On the southern shoulder, Manstein's forces made deeper progress. The 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf pushed toward Oboyan and Prokhorovka. The southern fields seemed to offer the kind of mobile battle German commanders understood. Tiger tanks could dominate at range. Luftwaffe support struck Soviet positions, but the terrain, mines, ravines, anti-tank guns, and Soviet reserves kept compressing the attack. A breakthrough required not just destroyed positions, but a widening corridor, steady supply, and enough fresh armor to exploit success. Kursk was therefore not simply a tank duel, it was a battle of systems. German tactical skill remained dangerous, and individual armored formations could still tear holes in a line. But the Red Army had learned from 1941 and 1942. It used intelligence, defense in depth, camouflage, engineering, reserve armies, and industrial replacement to make German strength less decisive. The Soviet plan accepted terrible losses because it aimed to drain an offensive that Germany could not afford to repeat. The most famous image of Kursk is Prokhorovka on July 12th, where Soviet 5th Guards tank army attacked German armored forces in a violent close-range fight. For decades, memory turned Prokhorovka into the simple story of the greatest tank clash and a clean Soviet triumph. The surviving record is more complicated. Soviet losses were heavy, German losses that day were likely lower than older myths suggested, and historians still argue over exact totals. But Prokhorovka mattered because it helped halt the southern drive at the moment when German leaders needed momentum, not another costly pause. While Citadel strained forward, the wider war moved against Germany. The Western Allies landed in Sicily on July 10th, forcing Hitler to think about Italy and the Mediterranean. In the east, Soviet counteroffensives were ready. Operation Kutuzov struck the Orel salient north of Kursk, and Operation Rumyantsev later drove toward Belgrade and Kharkov. The Germans had wanted to cut off the Soviet salient. Instead, after the offensive stalled, the Red Army began pushing into German-held salients of its own. The decision to stop Citadel is sometimes told as one moment caused by Sicily, but that is too neat. The offensive was already losing the operational race. German formations had not gained the decisive encirclement they needed. Soviet reserves remained. Casualties and mechanical losses mounted. A battle designed to regain initiative instead consumed the mobile strength Germany hoped to use for future decisions. Sicily accelerated the strategic pressure, but Kursk itself showed that the Eastern Front had changed. For soldiers, the change was not abstract. It was a mine blast under a track, a burned field outside a village, a gun crew waiting until a tank filled its sight, a medic crossing open ground, a radio message lost in static, an engine failure at the worst possible hour. Kursk's scale can make it feel impersonal, but the battle was fought through thousands of small acts of fear, discipline, confusion, and endurance. The sources give commanders and armies, the ground gave mud, smoke, steel, and bodies. The aftermath was decisive because Germany never again launched a major strategic offensive in the east. That does not mean the war was easy after Kursk. The Red Army still faced years of horrific fighting, and Soviet victory came at staggering human cost, but the direction of initiative had shifted. After Kursk, Germany increasingly reacted. The Soviet Union increasingly chose when and where the next blow would fall. The road to the Dnieper, Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and Berlin was still long, but the operational balance had turned. Kursk also changed how modern viewers should understand armored warfare. Tanks mattered, but tanks alone did not decide the battle. Intelligence mattered, mines mattered, air power mattered, repair crews, rail lines, fuel trucks, artillery ammunition, and reserves mattered. A dramatic charge could win a field and still fail as an operation if the defender had another belt behind it. That lesson is why Kursk still appears whenever people debate attrition, breakthrough, and the cost of offensive war. The danger is to make Kursk a simple parable. It was not a chess puzzle solved by one clever defense, and it was not a machine-age tournament where the best tank won. It was a vast clash between two states that had learned, adapted, and mobilized at terrible scale. German commanders tried to recover a lost initiative. Soviet commanders accepted risk and loss to destroy that attempt. The result was not inevitable on the morning of July 5th, but the conditions had been prepared. That is also why the battle resists clean hero shots. A commander's arrow on a chart could suggest motion, but the real battlefield slowed motion down into labor. Engineers lifting mines by hand, tank drivers searching for safe lanes, infantrymen lying still while artillery corrected, mechanics dragging damaged vehicles back under cover, and staff officers deciding whether a reserve should move now or wait for the next breach. Kursk turned time itself into a weapon. Every hour the German pincers failed to meet, Soviet reserves became more useful, German fuel and spare parts became more strained, and the promise of a quick encirclement became less believable. For Germany, the cost was not only the tanks destroyed in July. It was the opportunity cost of committing elite armored formations to a battle the enemy had prepared for. For the Soviet Union, the cost was paid in lives on a scale that should prevent any easy celebration. Victory came through preparation, intelligence, discipline, and sacrifice, but also through a willingness to absorb losses that would have shattered smaller armies. Kursk is therefore a story about power and endurance, not just battlefield brilliance. By the end of the Kursk campaign in August, the salient remained Soviet. Orel and Kharkov had fallen back into Soviet hands, and the German army had spent strength it could not restore. The battle's clearest meaning is not that one day or one tank duel ended the Second World War. It is that the last German bid to seize the Eastern Front's strategic initiative met a defense built for exactly that bid. Kursk broke the gamble. After it, the war in the East still burned, but it burned mostly westward.